My latest read is The Invisibles, written by Jesse J Holland. That's the White House on the front. And this is a story about the African American slaves who helped build the White House, as well as were slaves to the earliest and earlier presidents. It seems to me it is a work in progress, and he is continuing on by still searching, or when he learns of new information about slaves in that era, he's keeping track of all that. One thing I found interesting, now I'm old enough, we didn't get Black history or any of that in school, and one thing I learned from it was when the earliest slaves were purchased in the early 1600s there in one of the northernmost 13 colonies, they were at the status of indentured servants because the British were in charge at that time. In a very, not that indentured servant was all that much better than slave, but it was somewhat. In a few short decades, they would be slave status. The Spanish brought in the first slaves to America into Georgia. The Spanish were very involved in the slave trade. But back to, let's start with George Washington. I'm not going to tell everything that's in the book, but he never did live in the White House. I guess his place was in New York. He had, at the time of his death, 123 slaves. His wife, Martha, was not real comfortable with having that many slaves, and apparently slaves would occasionally, if their masters weren't good to them, poison their masters. They did run away, you can't blame them, and sometimes they got caught too. And there is an account in here about a slave revolt type of thing. The numbers are not great, but they did do some killing of people who owned slaves. Also, the author has more information on some presidents than he does others, and that's because of record keeping on the slaves. Dolly Madison, who was wife of President James Madison, when he died, he stipulated in his will that slaves were to stay put. But Dolly Madison came upon hard times, and she was selling them off here and there. So you can see how precarious a slave's life is. There was no real stability for them, even when a master had stipulated for them to stay on. There's a chapter in here about Thomas Jefferson. We now know he sired a white side of the Jefferson family, as well as a black side of the Jefferson family with his concubine slave Sally Hemings. And it goes into the involvement that presidents, their own life was intertwined in the lives of their slaves. Her brother was apparently a very good chef. Jefferson liked French food. And there's quite a bit of other detail about Jefferson and his slaves in here. Like I said, I found this very, very interesting. It's something that I know very little about. There's more information about presidents and their slaves, a lot of Americana. Apparently in the early days, the White House did not have indoor plumbing or anything, so they all went and used the common outhouse outside of the White House, and just different changes. I think I saw in the back where he mentioned it's fitting that these slaves be given credit for helping to build some of the White House, as well as the service they provided. And so that would mean to dedicate a monument or a plaque or something for them at the White House, and that does seem fair to me. But I hope you give the book a try. This is Americana at its very best, and although slavery is a blotch in American history, it's very much a part of American history. And many of the blanks are filled in about presidents and bits and pieces about the White House and probably the Washington, D.C. area. A fascinating work in progress. Thank you for listening.